Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we look ahead to the high-stakes United Nations General Assembly in New York City and what we can expect from President Biden and other key world leaders in their speeches there. And then we have a deep dive interview with Chris Sabatini of Chatham House about the political turmoil in Venezuela and whether President Nicolas Maduro has cemented his power. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Coming up this week, we have a deep dive with Chris Sabatini of Chatham House on the situation in Venezuela and what certainly looks like President Nicolas Maduro's successful efforts to hang on to power, despite apparently, at least according to the U.S. and a lot of other observers, losing an election recently there to his opponent. So we'll dig into that. Lots of great insights from Chris Sabatini coming up on that. But before we get to that interview, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar this week?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here for another week on the podcast. The big thing that I'm tracking is the convergence of world leaders, whether aligned with the U.S. or against the U.S., that's about to happen next week in New York City at the annual United Nations General Assembly, or UNGA, as it's known in diplomatic speak. The highlight of UNGA every year is the marathon of speeches that dozens of heads of state give in the storied General Assembly Hall. There's great anticipation, usually right up to the last minute, on what major U.S. enemy or adversary head of state will give the most anti-U.S. speech. And then there's always anticipation on what U.S. leader will take the stage. In this case, President Biden. As of taping this episode, he's slated to speak on September 24, and I anticipate he's going to focus on a wide range of things, particularly the war in the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine war. Whether he says anything truly noteworthy is up for speculation. I think everyone in attendance, assuming the Biden speech actually happens, will be watching very closely for signs of his old age and deteriorating mental capacity. This will effectively be the biggest stage that President Biden has been on since the Democratic National Convention in August. The stakes could be very high if Biden appears incoherent, or if a foreign adversary leader, specifically Iran's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who's actually slated to speak on the same day as Biden, attacks President Biden rhetorically or the U.S., or seeks to stir the pot with angry rhetoric accusing the United States of being the cause of everything wrong in the world. That is a typical theme when an Iranian head of state speaks at UNGA. I've covered the General Assembly gathering from Midtown Manhattan several times over the past decade, and there are two things that are always highlights for me. One is the behind-the-scenes meetings that go on among senior U.S. diplomats and their counterparts from countries around the world. It's essentially a circus of meetings and handshakes and photo ops. This will actually be Secretary of State Antony Blinken's last UNGA as the top U.S. diplomat, as he said he's going to be eventually leaving the post. From a journalist point of view, the State Department Correspondents Association, that very closely covers every move of the Secretary of State, typically throws an invite-only party or happy hour that the Secretary of State and his top behind-the-scenes advisors show up and mingle for a bit off the record with accredited journalists. It's all very interesting. I digress here again. Last year, Secretary General Antonio Guterres gave a speech that received almost zero global media attention. Of course, I wrote about it in the Washington Times, though, in which he warned everyone in attendance that artificial intelligence may lead the world into, quote, more danger than we can control, end quote. And he called on world leaders to consider creating a global organization akin to the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency to address both the benefits and the dangers of artificial intelligence, specifically those associated with the fast emerging realm of generative AI. Amazingly, that speech seemed very new a year ago. If you think how far the narrative on AI has gone politically around the world over the past year, it's rather stunning. What we have seen is an accelerating shift in global great power, with China, Russia, and Iran and North Korea aligning together in a kind of authoritarian axis against the U.S. and Western democracies. It's important to note that this alignment has paralyzed the UN Security Council to nearly unprecedented levels, Ben, given that China and Russia, like the U.S., hold veto power over anything the Security Council tries to do, such as uphold international sanctions on anyone China or Russia is aligned with, specifically Iran. Finally, Ben, consider what Secretary General Guterres said earlier this year. He said that, quote, today's global order is not working for everyone. In fact, I would go further and say it's not working for anyone, end quote. So that dark note hangs over what will be the biggest and freest, really, gathering of world leaders of the year next week in New York City.
It's such a fascinating event. I mean, we've both been there. You more times than I, but I remember the first time I was there was in 2013 when I was covering the Obama White House, and the focus then was on whether President Barack Obama would meet with then Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. And, I ended up dubbing it the quote handshake that wasn't unquote, because there was just so much focus on whether they were going to get together. This was, of course, during the run up to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And as we later learned, and as Guy and I have done a lot of reporting on, there was plenty of behind the scenes interactions between U.S. and Iranian officials in those years, in 2013 and 2014, during UNGA, leading up to the JCPOA, which was signed in July of 2015. So the speeches are one thing, and they're fascinating to watch. The behind the scenes interactions, sort of the back rooms where a lot of business gets done, and in more than one case where significant sort of, world altering treaties and agreements can be made. A lot of that gets done there during UNGA in New York City, in hotel lobbies and at bars and what have you. So it's a big deal for a variety of reasons. And we remember a lot of major moments from some of these UN speeches. Speaking of Iran, I think everybody remembers Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's, infamous red line that he drew in 2012, talking about Iran's nuclear bomb. Donald Trump in 2019 denounced globalists, which is an interesting thing to say while you're at the UN, of course. And we can go on and on with memorable moments from key world leaders. But, the focus, I think, rightly, is going to be on Joe Biden. And you mentioned a lot of the reasons why. One of the things I'm wondering here is just, what's his approach going to be to his speech? Does he view this, if this is one of his last high profile speeches, short of his, what I would assume would be a farewell address at some point before he leaves office, but if this is one of his last big high profile speeches, it's going to get coverage everywhere. Does he see it as a chance to give his rah rah America address, talking about how the U.S. needs to keep leading the world, not allow authoritarian governments like China to become the planet's preeminent powers? Is he going to take a victory lap, for, in his mind, all the things that he's accomplished on foreign policy over his more than 50 years now in public office? I don't know, but I think what I do know is that it's going to be very important for him to go in on a high note, personally, for his legacy, to kind of use a cliche. It was embarrassing for him to get pushed out of the presidential race like he was, and a strong speech at the UN won't necessarily erase that. But, as you say, if he comes across as a commanding figure, or at least a competent one, someone who still understands all the nuances of foreign policy and all the complicated details wrapped up in geopolitics, I do think that might impact how we all remember Joe Biden going forward.
Chris Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House, the renowned London-based think tank. Chris, you're a scholar, have been for a long time on all things relating to economics, geopolitics, and politics across Latin America. You've been a source and a friend of mine on all issues in the region for quite a while, including for my own several reporting, fact-finding, journalistic trips there over the years. So thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status podcast.
Thanks, Guy. Actually, I'm looking forward to this. I always like your probing questions, your pushing and pulling me, and your objectivity. So I've been really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I'll take that as a compliment. Let's start with a simple question, but I think it's worth asking given that what we've really seen over the past several months in Venezuela. Is it over now? Has Nicolas Maduro effectively stolen this election and remained in power, or is there another shoe that could drop here? What's your assessment?
It certainly looks like it's over, and the chances of any dramatic change, I think, are diminishing with each day. The Nicolas Maduro government clearly intends and hopes that it can just move on, and the rest of the world will sort of just pick and focus more on other global crises and not what's going on in Venezuela, and that the demand for oil and some form of normalization will then, force him to be able to force the rest of the world to just look beyond and allow him to continue. That said, he's got a 6-year term coming up. He will be inaugurated on January 10th. First of all, this is a long time up until the inauguration, and it's a long term. And he's heading into this with basically the entire world, and including people within his inner circle, knowing that he stole an election. He's failed to produce the actas, the tabulations that demonstrate his claims to victory by basically 52% to 47%, despite multiple demands, even from some potential allies. I'm not sure Lula of Brazil or Petro of Colombia really are ideologically adjacent. I'm not sure they're actually allies. But the whole world realizes that this has been a theft. So that said, again, each day that goes by ensures he'll be entrenched, and unfortunately, the likelihood that the world will just want to move on. But anything can happen. I mean, I think some of it depends on the international community's reactions in the next couple months. Some of it will depend on if there are any fractures within his regime, and some of it will depend on popular reaction. Unfortunately, what we're already seeing is a diminishing of energy and will to turn out to the streets peacefully by the opposition and citizens to denounce his victory. But by the same token, and really almost an insanely cruel twist in the world today, what Maduro has been doing has been signaling he will crack down with impunity on anyone who steps out in the street, and even inflating the numbers of people he's been detaining.
Chris, it's Ben Wolfgang. Thank you so much for coming here in the show. You mentioned Nicolas Maduro's inner circle. Have you seen any cracks in that inner circle or elsewhere in the government? It seemed like, from my perch here watching from the U.S., that he was able to more or less keep everyone on his side, the military, election officials, judiciary, other arms of the government. Is that how you see it as well, or are there maybe beneath the surface some cracks inside the regime that could be exploited?
The short answer, Ben, is no. There's no sign of cracks. You're absolutely right. And I think, and a lot of us were guilty of perhaps optimism, and I think at the time, just sheer disbelief that someone could so cynically steal an election and then just so cynically repress and openly repress that we assumed there'd be some cracks. So we spent a lot of time before the election, myself included, trying to read between the lines on some of the guy who is the head of the army now. He's sort of head Padrino Lopez, which, by the way, Padrino means Godfather, so it's actually a fitting last name. I'm not sure that was by choice, but he at the time was saying, "Well, I'll support whoever wins." Well, clearly he's demonstrated he's all in. He controls the armed forces. Then there's Diosdado Cabello, whose name in English translates literally to God-given hair. He was moved over from just heading the intelligence service to being head of all the security apparatus. So basically, Maduro has packed his system with loyalists, as well as Delcy Rodriguez, his vice president, now also occupies the role of energy minister. So what he's done is, if there were any cracks at all within that inner circle, he's basically removed them. And he's packed it entirely with loyalists. What that also means is none of these people, Padrino Lopez, Diosdado Cabello, Delcy Rodriguez, have been not at all timid about demonstrating their willingness to use force against the opposition. The hope is that at some point, some of the enlisted officers will begin to have doubts about firing on their own citizens. And these are people who are underpaid, are not part of the corrupt machine. And this is truly a criminal mafia government that benefits and receives rents from from narcotics trafficking, illegal gold mining, money laundering, and it has the support of Russia and China, not to mention Cuba and Nicaragua, although they don't offer much in terms of financial support. This criminal network is, they're afraid to give up the goods, basically, and they're afraid they would end up very likely in jail. The only hope, as I mentioned, is the lower level soldiers and police officers who are not beneficiaries of this incredible venality. What they are mostly citizens, common citizens. Many of their families have fled. More than 8 million Venezuelans have left the country. A quarter of the country is left because of the economic conditions. The hope there is that they may, at a certain point, ally themselves with, if you will, their sort of socioeconomic equivalents, cohorts, and somehow refuse to fire on the troops, on the citizens. But that's not at all clear.
Venezuela has a lot of oil. It's a heavy kind of crude oil. I would like to know your take on who in the international landscape is actually getting that oil, and does it include the United States? What is the state of that? And then within the context of that question, based on what you're saying about Maduro's partners internationally, should we be considering Venezuela as a member of this so-called axis of authoritarians alongside or a partner of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea? What's your take on those two pieces of it?
First, on the oil, Venezuela sits on top of the largest known reserves in the world. Now, as you mentioned, Guy, most of that is heavy crude, so it requires special equipment, special processing, and special diluents, basically to lighten the oil, to make it more usable. Under the era of the Trump maximum pressure sanctions, which started in 2019, it prohibited the sale to Venezuela of those diluents. So it actually, while there are other problems even before the sanctions of Venezuela being able to produce its own oil and sell it on the international market. In fact, at the time, in 1998, Venezuela was pumping about 3 million barrels of oil a day. Because of lack of upkeep, because of incompetence within the government, because of corruption, that had sunk to about 500,000 barrels of oil a day, even by 2019. So people like to blame the sanctions. The sanctions have had other unintended consequences, but the collapse of the oil sector in Venezuela traces its roots directly to the incompetence and theft of the Chavez and Maduro government. Now, having said that, what they've done with these sanctions is they have been able to get access to some diluents, access to shipping from China, from Iran, that has allowed them to continue pumping oil, and a lot of that oil went to China. Now, a curious thing happened is that when the sanctions were imposed on Russia in 2022, China, for obvious reasons, turned to Russia to get most of its oil. So there is even a split within this axis of authoritarians, as you mentioned, Guy, is that Venezuela sort of ended up on the short end of the stick because of sanctions, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and because of sanctions being imposed on Russia. Having said that, in 2022, when sanctions were lifted for Chevron to be able to reinvest in Venezuela, part of the deal was most of that oil that it would produce. It hasn't been massive amounts, let's be honest. Chevron, in fact, oversold what it could produce because the decay of the infrastructure was so severe. Most of that oil had to be shipped to the United States. And that was the deal. And then later in 2019, after the Barbados Agreement, which established supposedly the foundation for free and fair elections in 2024, which we just had July 28th, the others that came in were also supposed to operate under limited licenses. Indeed, oil production has increased, but there are limits in how much it can increase. How much has Venezuela joined this axis of authoritarians? And it has. It's fully in league with them. The first governments to recognize Maduro's victory were that of Putin and that of Xi Jinping, as well as Cuba and Nicaragua. So it's not, let's be honest, we're not talking about this is a rogues gallery, if you will, of governments respecting an election, and they haven't stood down. They experienced and shown no remorse whatsoever for rushing to acknowledge Maduro's stolen election. And what do they hope to get out of this is the question. I think in part, part of it is just a finger in the eye of the United States. It's great that you've got a dumpster fire in the U.S. hemisphere, just about 5 hours flight from New York, for example. China has real investments in Venezuela, and Venezuela owes them a lot of money. And China's frustrated by the incompetence. But in this case, just the symbolism and the irksomeness of their presence in the Western Hemisphere is enough for them to just wait until things settle down. And for Russia, this is golden, because also Venezuela has been a means by which Russia has been able to launder money. So that will continue. And this is what means that beyond the tragic suffering of Venezuelan people, in a country where 3/4 of the economy has collapsed since 2013, what you have is truly a national security problem in terms of illicit trafficking, in terms of narcotics generally, in terms of Russia complicitness with Russia and Iran. It is a true problem that goes beyond just the borders of Venezuela, but also beyond the Western Hemisphere.
So, Chris, what is the state right now, as you see it, of the opposition, the political opposition in Venezuela? Edmundo Gonzalez, the candidate who challenged Maduro in the presidential elections, and by most accounts seems to have gotten significantly more votes in that election, has now fled and is seeking asylum in Spain. And look, I mean, I don't want to blame him personally. He was put in a very difficult position given the threats to his safety, the arrest warrant that the government had issued. So he made a choice that maybe a lot of others would have made as well. But man, it sure looks to me like that has to be a devastating, almost lethal blow to the opposition right now in Venezuela, no?
Not to phrase this as glass half full, but the opposition, basically from 1999, which is when Chavez was sworn in, he's elected in 98, has made a whole series of missteps that has weakened their position. They've been fragmented. Their original strategy was to protest, and hope that something would fracture, even though Chavez at the time was very popular. They then staged or basically triggered a coup that led to Chavez's ouster for 24 hours, and then shut down the Constitution. So the army returned him because it seemed to go far beyond what many people wanted. And then they, with some regularity, abstained from elections, which removed them and basically ceded the National Assembly and local governments to the Chavistas, and they were just out of the game. In this case, and this is why I think the opposition is in a stronger position, but it's only relative to past experience. In this case, they did participate in the elections. The Maduro government tried several times all of its old tricks to get them to take the bait, including trying to basically disqualifying candidates, thinking the opposition will pull out and say, okay, nope, we're not going to play any longer. And in fact, they stayed in the game. And so what you're seeing now, this popularity in which, if you look at, and really, statisticians from Stanford University, Brazil, Spain, and the US have confirmed that the actas, the voting tabulations that the opposition has, are valid, and that the election would be impossible to overturn given those 80% ballots, given patterns. They show that Edmundo Gonzalez won twice as many votes as Maduro. So now you actually have an opposition that has democratic legitimacy. It has the backing of the international community, which before was many people, myself included, but diplomats with far more import than I, were saying, why the hell are they staying out of this election? Now they actually are in the game, and that's important. And yes, Edmundo Gonzalez's asylum was difficult, but he's a 75-year-old retired diplomat. Political prison doesn't suit 75-year-olds particularly well. So I certainly understand. Now, is the opposition a weaker position? Yes. In part because he didn't turn himself into being a martyr, which I understand. Now he's in Madrid. And the truth is the Venezuelan opposition has a long history of opposition leaders and wannabe presidents who've gone into exile, whose profiles and power has basically faded as they've gone into exile. There are two differences here, though. One is Edmundo Gonzalez is a former diplomat, and now he's in a position as the de facto recognized president-elect. I think, thankfully, many governments are not rushing to name him the president. But now he can travel to Brussels, he's already in Madrid, he can travel to Washington, D.C., he can travel to Brazil and try to build on that credibility to try to strengthen a more meaningful international response. And we haven't seen a meaningful international response, and I can get to that. By the same token, Maria Corina Machado, for whom he was a stand-in, she had been disqualified in January this year, she's remaining. And she really is the charismatic authority behind Edmundo Gonzalez's opposition. She was also one of the ones, by the way, who had argued for a long time for abstentionism in the elections. But she, I think this time really was in for the haul and performed very, very well. And so you've still got her. But having said that, you're right. And the government is trying to portray Edmundo Gonzalez's flight as one of cowardice and one that he doesn't stand by the people. And we'll see if that takes. But there are a number of things that make this very different than his predecessors who fled to. Most of them are in Madrid.
Chris, before we run out of time, I want to dig a little bit into U.S. policy right now. I mean, actually, the Biden administration tried with sanctions relief to inspire Maduro to allow the recent election, a whole strategy that I'm neutral on this and journalistic, but it seems like it backfired. Now we're in this situation, and now the most recent move saw U.S. authorities actually seize Maduro's official airplane in the Dominican Republic. Apparently, it was on a runway there. They've impounded it to Florida. What was the point of that? Is there any kind of geopolitical or national security benefit to that move, or was that just a very public way for the U.S., the Biden administration, to express its displeasure with how the election was conducted?
So, Guy, I appreciate your journalistic objectivity. I will say this about the Biden administration sort of leveraging of sanctions and lifting of them temporarily and in a very modest way, was we are at the point where we are now, that we did have elections, they're truly flawed, and the world is watching, and the opposition's unified. Now, that is, it's necessary, it's certainly not sufficient for change. I do think people underestimated the cynicism and the cruelty of this government. I do think that we could, if anything, be accused of perhaps a little bit of optimism, but when a policy failed, the past policies had failed, it's time to try something new. Now, that doesn't mean it's successful. And I think the problem right now is where the world needs to act. And to my mind, the bigger problem for the United States and the White House right now is that it's ceding leadership to Brazil and Colombia and Mexico, because they're seen as being, as I mentioned earlier, sort of adjacent ideologically to the Maduro government, but they're also not doing much. And the truth is, there comes a point. In fact, they issued a statement about a week and a half ago that was just mealy-mouthed. It unnecessarily just announced U.S. sanctions. It didn't actually. They've been calling on the Maduro government to produce the tabulations. It hasn't. And then what? I mean, it's a bit like that scene in Team America when the Kim Jong-il character says, "What are you going to do? Write me another strongly worded memo?" You know, what is going to happen? Will it just be another strongly worded memo? And so now comes the time where Brazil and Petro of Colombia have to put on their pants. If they want to be peacemakers, if they want to be global leaders, they need to show a little bit of resolve. And if not, then the U.S. is going to have to step up with Europe. And what that will mean is the U.S. needs to start imposing targeted individual sanctions. We could argue whether energy-based sanctions should snap back. There's an argument on both sides. I see the reason why maybe Chevron should get shut down, but because that is basically what's underwriting a large part of the government's revenue. But the U.S. needs to step up, and so far it has outsourced its leadership too much to Brazil and Colombia that have really not shown the sort of diplomatic nimbleness that is necessary. And to be honest, in domestic politics in both countries, there is blowback for these governments for not doing this, whether it's Brazilian moderates, including business, and well as Colombians. They really are taking it to both of the presidents, Petro of Colombia and Lula of Brazil. And so hopefully between the combination of U.S. pressure and domestic pressure, they can step up. If not, the White House will have to.
Hey, Chris Sabatini, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
It was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home or in some corner of the world, that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. Guy, my threat of the week this week is the huge gap in America's icebreaker fleet. So the large ships capable of smashing through very thick ice and operating in Arctic and Antarctic waters. Our colleague Mike Glenn had a good deep dive on this subject a few weeks ago in the Washington Times, and it's an issue I've been tracking for years and one that's only getting more serious. And it's really simple when you break it down. We don't have working icebreakers right now as the United States of America. The Coast Guard's two heavy icebreakers, the Healy and the Polar Star, are both down for maintenance. Earlier this summer, the Healy went down after a fire in its engineering compartment, and the Polar Star is undergoing major maintenance at a dock right now in California. So if you go to a tail of the tape here, we've got 0 working icebreakers. Russia has more than 40 icebreakers. China has 4. Canada has 21. We have 0, at least none that are working right now. This is largely, a faraway part of the world to a lot of Americans, so it's not necessarily top of mind for all of us on a daily basis, but it's really important. It's a strategically vital area, partly because melting sea ice is opening up new shipping lanes, and countries that have the ice breaking capability to go in there and chop away at some of that melting ice could potentially get an economic leg up. Certainly, that's a big reason for China's interest in the region and its construction of icebreakers. Some analysts that Mike Glenn quoted in the story dubbed it a crisis, and it is. Efforts to speed up the construction of new icebreakers have had all sorts of snags and delays. It's really expensive. Not a lot of companies can build these very large, very complex ships. But at the end of the day, we need to do something because, look, sometimes, God, there's a lot of nuance in national security and geopolitics, but sometimes it's really clear and really obvious. And in this case, we're way behind our adversaries in terms of icebreakers. And that's why it's my threat of the week right now.
My threat of the week is that anti-democratic leaders will exploit the UN General Assembly as a platform to smear the United States on the global media stage with speeches that get spouted out to global South media markets where Chinese government-controlled and Russian government-controlled news networks will give dissemination power to that anti-US messaging in ways that resonate. And then that the U.S. at the end of the Biden administration doesn't do enough to push back publicly with its own speeches and flourish on the main stage of the world leader gathering in New York. There is a chance at the UN for the U.S. to stand very firmly for democracy and freedom around the world. Hopefully, President Biden is able to do that this year. And whatever he and Secretary of State Blinken and U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, do at UNGA does resonate, both in international media coverage and with the many, many delegations that will be on hand.
We're going to keep a close eye on it. That's for sure. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Guy, for joining us as always. And a huge thanks to Chris Sabatini from Chatham House for that great deep dive on Venezuela. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will be back as always next week here on the Threat Status Podcast.